Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco, and it's my pleasure to welcome two special guests to our stage today. We have with us the Honorable Judge Robert Rancourt, judge on the Minnesota District Court in Chisago County, and we have with us also Jim Eberspacher, who is the coordinator for the Minnesota State Drug Courts. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to Access to Democracy, your first appearance on our show.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. We appreciate being here.
Thanks for being here. So let me start with you, Judge. Our topic today is the drug court in Minnesota. What do we mean when we say the drug court?
I think a little background, Steve, may be helpful for the viewers to understand the nature of how this all started. In 1989, the first drug court started in Dade County, Florida. Subsequent to that, in 1994, the first 12 drug court judges in the nation started the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, which is a 501c nonprofit. And currently we have approximately 2,700 drug courts nationally and about 1,200 problem-solving courts.
How many in Minnesota?
Yeah, in Minnesota we currently have 37. And again, background there, Steve, the drug courts in Minnesota, the first one we had was in 1996 in Hennepin County. 2002, I think we had 2, and now we have the 37.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, your job as state coordinator for the drug court system, what does that involve? What do you do?
Well, I serve as a state point of contact for the Minnesota Judicial Branch on all drug court and problem-solving court related matters. I provide technical assistance and training to the local courts in the outlying districts and counties throughout the state. And I also advise them on policies, state policies, best practices for drug courts, and also connect them with national and state resources.
And so you actually have a long background in corrections yourself, don't you? Tell us a little bit about that.
I do. In 1998, I started as a juvenile probation officer in Dakota County. In their,
right here?
Yes, in their new secure facility at the time. It was their Juvenile Services Center. Newly built, spent 2 years there, went to field work in International Falls, Minnesota for about 8 years doing juvenile probation there, and then in 2004, a Judge Charles LeDuc asked me if I was interested in drug courts. At the time, I said, why not? I really didn't know what they were, but I saw some issues with the way the traditional supervision system was, not only with juveniles but adults, and I thought, can't hurt, give it a shot. And so we went to training and in Charlotte, North Carolina at the time. Learned a little bit about it, and really within the first 2 hours of hearing about what drug courts were and the different philosophies, I was sold on it. So I became his coordinator.
Good. Well, Judge Rancourt, so give our viewers a better understanding, if you would, of who are the people that we would find in drug court, and are there some folks that the drug court is not necessarily the appropriate place for their cases to be disposed of?
Steve, that's a great question. The best success we have in drug courts are with those people that are high risk, high need, and by that I mean they have certain criminogenic factors, that's what they refer to, And in criminogenic factors, you'll have dynamic risk factors as well as static. And dynamic relates to where they live, how much they're using, environment, jobs, things like that.
I've never heard that word, criminogenic?
Criminogenic, yes. And then you have static risk factors. Those static risk factors are factors relating to prior criminal history, convictions, things like that, Steve, arrest. So what we try to do is, with an assessment tool, is determine those high-risk, high-need individuals. Those are the ones that belong in drug court, and they have the most success in drug court. They're the non-violent group. So what we do is we'll do an assessment. Most of these courts are post-plea, pre-adjudication courts. They're voluntary. People come into those courts voluntarily. And what drove us to take a look at this as far as criminal justice reform was that we were not having success as far as recidivism rates with individuals who were going to prison. They were coming out committing crimes, many up to 30% recidivism rates coming out of the Department of Corrections. And so we started looking at different ways to address that population. As we present to the legislature, what happens many times, of course, is they're looking at net cost, benefit, and cost factors, and Jim can certainly discuss the evaluation we recently had. But, for example, we have 9,500 in our prison systems in Minnesota today, in prison, not our county jails, just prison. And about 2,300 of that population are there primarily, in fact, they are there for convictions relating to drug and alcohol issues, convictions relating to those types of crimes. The remaining population are there for burglaries and other things, but they may have an alcohol or drug component. Well, that population, to serve them, Steve, costs about $6 million a month, just for that 2,300.
Wow.
And $72 million per year. So when we look at, obviously they look at the cost benefit of putting them in a drug court where it may be $7,600 per year per participant versus that number. And you're also seeing tremendous success rates that have been proven by meta-analysis, particularly in 2006. They did about 5 meta-analysis, which is an average, a scientific tool where they look at a conservative approach of drug courts. And they had 5 separate ones to show a reduction in recidivism from 8 to 25%, with 70% of those courts even doing better than that, and with the best drug courts having recidivism reductions of 45%.
So there's an argument to be made here that actually the drug court, in addition to helping people get their lives back on track, it's also a good deal for taxpayers, which is a concern in times of austerity and tight budgets for state and local government. And Jim, I'd like to ask you about that actually. Sure. I think many Minnesotans are aware that there are issues right now with adequate funding for state services, including the judiciary. What types of budgetary or financial pressures have the drug courts in Minnesota had to contend with in the past few years?
Well, we get a lot of our funding from state and federal grants. When drug courts are interested in planning, local jurisdictions are interested in planning drug courts, they put a team together of professionals, that represent different justice system partners. And when they're ready to implement, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is through the Department of Justice, offers a wide variety of funding.
These are competitive grants?
They're
Does
competitive
Minnesota
grants.
compete with other states for this money?
They do, nationwide, really. We've been very successful in Minnesota in being awarded these types of grants, both for implementation and for enhancing drug court practices.
Do you have any figures on, for example, in 2012, how much in federal grants did Minnesota receive?
We have
roughly
a dollar amount. I'm not sure I can give you a dollar amount, but we have probably about close to a dozen courts who have some type of federal assistance through grants.
Significant out of 30, what was it,
37.
Judge? 37 drug
Yes.
courts in the state of Minnesota.
Right.
In our court system, our district courts are organized by county, right?
Right.
By judicial district.
Yes.
And voters obviously elect those judges. But you're still facing these budgetary pressures, even though the drug courts have a proven record of reducing recidivism and diverting people and saving taxpayers some money at the same time.
Correct.
I heard a figure the other day. I was listening to National Public Radio yesterday in my car as I was driving around, and there was a story on, somebody was on that was pointing out that the United States incarcerates more people than any other industrial country in the world. We have over 2 million Americans who are incarcerated right now. And contrary to what many people may think, the vast majority of people in our prison system are not necessarily there for violent offenses, but many of them are incarcerated for what lawyers, attorneys, we sometimes refer to as status offenses, that you were in possession of alcohol underage or possession of drugs or something. So isn't the drug court playing a significant role in diverting people away from incarceration and toward better outcomes? It's not for everybody, right, Judge?
Right. No, you are right, Steve. In point of fact, there's not that many status offenses that would actually be in prison. They may be in the county
jail. Incarcerated, right, for
yes.
maybe short term.
Right. Yeah. And so, when you look at the issues of drug and alcohol and the impact on the courts, you're looking at the front end as far as prevention. And that's where the drug court model, where you have collaboration, if you will, between prosecutors, public defenders, the judge, of course, public health, mental health, law, county attorneys, we're all sitting at the table together prior to going out into court to address that particular individual's need. So it's a collaborative process, and what's happened as a result of the collaborative process, our communities now reach out more to the community. Our courts are reaching out to the community more, where we're getting involved with the educators, which is the first place, if you will, that we feel we can intervene with a lot of these young people looking at public health issues for these kids. They have tremendous strain right now, obviously dealing with opiates, they're dealing with synthetic drugs, they're dealing with alcohol. And when we have numbers like we have, Steve, in our state, I believe the most recent statistic is children from the ages of 12 and over, over 60% will indicate they've tried alcohol in the last 30 days. I think the only other state that's higher is Rhode Island at about 63%. So, we have to address those issues in a smart way for us to stop the recycling of families through our courts.
Right.
Stop that cycle of addiction in families. And we're seeing some really good results as a result of that, because the courts have been around long enough to start seeing this, Steve.
And as you and I were discussing before we started taping, Judge, it turns out that my wife and I actually have a very dear friend of ours who is a judge on the Hennepin District Bench and has done duty on the drug court. And I actually have had the privilege of sitting literally right up on the bench with him, right next to him during a visit to the drug court. And something really significant happened the day I was there. They had a young lady who was appearing before him. She was at the completion of her journey through the drug court system. She avoided incarceration, and she went and she completed her GED, and she had found housing, and she had found a new job. And it was a very emotional event when the judge, my friend, recognized this young woman for what she had done. Everybody in court had tears in their eyes, because this woman gave a very moving speech. She said, "Nobody ever told me I was worth anything, and nobody has ever recognized anything good that I have ever done." And it was very powerful, and it's something that I suspect you don't necessarily see in the regular district court system, because you probably not only do drug court, but you preside in the regular district court too.
And just to follow up with that, Steve, I'm very proud to be a judge of the state. We have my colleagues in the state do a tremendous job day in and day out dealing with the impact of alcohol and drugs across the board: child protection cases, criminal cases, dissolution cases, across the board. And just to share a short story with you as well, I remember a young lady on my juvenile drug court calendar coming in through a detention facility, and she was very agitated, coming off some drugs, methamphetamine, 16, 17-year-old girl, indicating she's going to come into our drug court, and indicated to me that she she really wanted some help. And I told her that I wouldn't quit her on her, and she turned around and said, "I'm not going to quit on you either." Well, what happened is that about 14 months later, this girl who was failing school, not having any relationships with her family and friends, all of a sudden, after she graduated, sent us a beautiful exit letter indicating exactly she had her self-esteem back, she graduated from school, and is doing very well now. And I compare that, and I teach judges too on the impact of alcohol and drugs, and I compare it to an obituary I once read that I keep in my chambers. And the obituary was about a 16 or 17-year-old girl that said she died after a long battle with addiction. And that's a motivator to me. And I know it's a motivator to many judges in our state, because that should not happen. We have enough resources, we have enough early intervention where we can help young people not to take their own lives. And, and that's what our judges do daily in this state,
They're not so much, it's perhaps contrary to the image a lot of people have of judges. And as you and I have discussed earlier, I know several of these judges very well. And they're not really out so much to punish people as to help get them on track and to avoid incarceration wherever possible. Now, there's no question certain offenders, violent offenders, they have to be incarcerated to protect the public safety. But we have a problem in our country and here in Minnesota where you have a lot of people who need help with substance abuse issues, alcohol, illegal use of pharmaceuticals, and we don't seem to have enough treatment programs, or the argument we hear from St. Paul is there isn't enough money to put people into the treatment programs that they have. So the drug court helps identify treatment programs for people, but are you seeing this pushback too in terms of reduced public funding for some of these treatment programs that could help keep people out of drug court and keep them out of the criminal justice system?
Well, it's interesting. The Minnesota legislature, we've had bipartisan support for these courts, which is interesting. And they've been very supportive of these courts and what we need and the resources to get the people the help they need, Steve. Obviously, this state, as well as any state of this country, is having issues with resources, with mental health resources, which is a big part of our drug courts, of course, as far as co-occurring disorders, as well as the issue of just treatment resources. But the idea of the drug court, and why I think the legislators support it so much, Steve, is that 70% of most people that enter treatment programs may drop out. And people are about 6 times, I think the rates are 6 times higher of success where a person is in a drug court going through treatment, that they'll complete it. And the reason being is that they're seeing a judge in that first phase of drug court every week.
There are benchmarks that they have to meet along the way, and if you don't meet them, as my friend the judge explained, you won't necessarily stay in the drug court.
And there's also immediate sanctions, community work service all the way up to county jail for immediate sanctions. So if you're using, we're on it right away. It's not delayed. And the old system, as you referred to, Steve, as far as how we handle things, is that they'd be on probation. They would violate probation and come before the court, but it may be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, so it's not immediate.
In doing some research to get ready for our interview, there seems to be very compelling evidence about the success of the drug courts, and we're going to talk further about that in a minute, including a study that I know both of you gentlemen are familiar with, the Star Tribune wrote about recently. But there doesn't seem to be universal agreement about the efficacy of the drug courts, and actually there are some critics of drug courts. There was something called the Drug Policy Alliance that issued a report in March last year. Drug courts are not the answer, finds that drug courts are ineffective and inappropriate response to drug law violations. What do you say to the critics who tell you that maybe the drug courts aren't as successful as they're portrayed?
And I'm familiar with those reports as well, Steve. Obviously, any program that we're involved with, and what I give great credit to this state as well, Steve, is we're dealing with standards through our drug court initiative, which is an advisory group to our judicial council, which I'm co-chair with County Attorney Backstrom. We develop standards with the help of Jim's office, of course, that these type of standards will show that these drug courts, if you follow the standards, are very, very successful. Again, when you have 5 separate meta-analysis referring to that,
they can't all be wrong?
They all can't be wrong. In addition, we've had 2 GAO reports.
Oh,
and
the Government Accountability Office.
Right, and you're familiar with those,
right.
Steve. And as a result, I believe that's why we have federal funding, obviously, in these grant programs through DOJ, Office of Justice Programs, and others, because they have seen the success of these drug courts as well. And, Director Kilikowski, who's the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy for President Obama, is a big supporter of them. So certainly going to have critics. That's understandable. And but I think the proof is in the result. And as you get into the Minnesota study, I think that even
Let's talk about that. That's a good
Certainly.
segue. And the Star Tribune editorial July 5th last year, drug courts are proving their value, and it cited you, Judge Rancourt, mentioned you there. But a couple of statistics stood out. And Jim, maybe you can speak to this.
Sure.
2.5 years after entering the program, 26% of drug court cohort had been charged with a new offense, compared to 41% in a comparison group. Drug court participants spent fewer days incarcerated, jail plus prison, than did the comparison group, saving the state on average $3,200 per participant over 2.5 years.
Just in incarceration costs alone.
Right.
I mean,
How about some of the other additional costs?
I mean, what we weren't able to do with the study was do a full cost-benefit analysis. But we did take a look at simply the incarceration costs. We took a look at improvement in pro-social factors for participants, increased education, getting your GED, high school diploma, college degrees, better employment, better living situations, improvement on paying child support. So we looked at a variety of factors, and we saw significant improvements for not only just graduates of drug courts, but people who just were in drug court, even if they didn't successfully complete. And we saw improvements there. We saw a reduction in crime, obviously. I think you mentioned charges and convictions for the comparison group. It was nearly twice as many had actually been convicted of a new crime. And when we talk about new crime, we aren't just talking about a small portion of crime. It wasn't just felonies. It was felonies, gross misdemeanors, and targeted misdemeanors, which are the lower level DWIs and some disorderly conducts.
It seems like the drug courts, too, you're on the front line, Judge. You and your colleagues on the bench are on the front line, along with police and prosecutors, in dealing with phenomena like as we saw recently, the growing use of crystal meth and other synthetic drugs that are causing terrible problems and causing people who are using those to go out to commit crimes that sometimes turn out much more tragically than the original crime. I'm referring, of course, to there are some indications that a young man who invaded a home is alleged to have invaded a home in Little Falls, Minnesota this past year, and ended up being shot to death by the homeowner, that he may have been stealing property repeatedly from that home and others to support a drug habit. So, these things you're on the front edge of this and getting the early warning of what's coming. What is coming? Are we getting a handle on the synthetic drug issue here in Minnesota, or can we expect to see this problem continuing or hopefully not even growing?
Well, the main issue in Minnesota still is alcohol, with most of our younger population as well as our adults. The opiate issue is becoming extremely concerning based upon the fact that a lot of the young people are getting OxyContin and through the medicine cabinet, Steve. And when they can no longer have access to OxyContin and they can't afford it, they're turning to heroin, similar components. And that's why you're seeing a rise in the Twin Cities as far as heroin is concerned right now. So drugs have a tendency to kind of move around from the standpoint of the urgency of the need to address some of these issues. And we have to try to be ahead of that curve all the time. And that's why I think in this state where we have we're a good state from the standpoint of trying to analyze the issue early on, through our mental health folks and Department of Human Services. Commissioner Justin does a great job, as far as I'm concerned, in dealing with some of these issues. She's come up with a strategic plan that was released in 2012, where drug courts were part of that strategic plan to address some of these issues long term and look at funding mechanisms long term. But yeah, it's a matter of trying to educate parents too, Steve, and I feel that's part of our obligation as well. So a lot of our judges throughout the state will go to the school. Chief Justice Gildy, our current Chief Justice, has been very supportive of some of these innovative programs, wants us to get out in the community to explain what's going on and what we're seeing in the courts so that we're not working in a vacuum.
Yeah. Good. And Jim, I guess as an administrator or coordinator for the drug court program in Minnesota, if I could grant your wish with all my powers, and you could go and ask the Minnesota legislature this session for whatever you needed to strengthen the Minnesota drug courts, what would be the thing you would ask of our state legislature this year?
You kind of put me on the spot there, Steve.
I didn't mean to, but
no, that's all right. My main
people
goal,
like getting their wishes granted. I can't grant your wish,
Right.
but I can ask the question.
I wish you could. My main goal when I took the position I'm in now, back in 2007, was to achieve full funding for drug courts, and have them have equal access statewide. And I think that's a goal, and one of the strategic priorities of the judicial branch is equal access to the courts, fair, and provide
Well,
justice.
shouldn't it actually a basic constitutional right that people should have the right to access to the courts?
Correct, and it is. And some people think drug courts, are a boutique type of courts, that they're expensive and that they're easy to do. They're not. It's all exactly the opposite. They might be a little expensive on the front end, but they end up saving people money. If we're ever going to achieve statewide access, the funding has to be there. And that's why, as you mentioned, it's a constitutional right. To get there, is going to take some time. And it's a balance of funding. And also, we've done quite well in the judicial branch to try to space out our growth.
And we should point out, you've had some advocates at the legislature in recent years too. I know that former Chief Justice Magnuson, who I got to meet several times, was a very articulate spokesperson on behalf of the courts and the judicial system in Minnesota, because you can't really say people have equal justice if they can't access the courts and if we can't dispose of their cases in a timely manner. The old adage, justice delayed is justice denied, is true.
Right.
Not
Correct.
just a saying. Yeah.
It is.
So as we look ahead, I know some states have looked at experiments, and Minnesota has too, with sort of a hybrid variation of the drug court, if you will, veterans courts, dealing with, we have a returning population of veterans from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who are dealing sometimes with substance abuse issues, and they find themselves caught up in the legal program. Do you think there are lessons that these emerging veterans courts can learn from the experience of the drug courts, Judge Rancourt?
Oh, there's no doubt, Steve, and I'm glad you raised that issue. Our veterans deserve to be treated with respect, and we have approximately 275,000 veterans right now of the 27 million that are in our criminal justice system, coming back from tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, many with post-traumatic stress as well as traumatic brain injury. So we do have a veterans treatment court in Hennepin County. We have veterans programs going on in Anoka County, Washington County, and some of our other courts. So I think, it's going to work very well.
Very good. Well, I want to tell both of you gentlemen, thank you so much for being our guests today on Access to Democracy, a really important topic and a very interesting one too. And Judge Rancourt, thank you for your service on the bench, serving the people of the state of Minnesota. Jim, likewise, thank you for serving our court system as state coordinator for the drug courts. Jim Eberspacher and Judge Robert Rancourt, the Chisago County District Court. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.